Like Ford, Carter assumes the presidency at a moment when the nation is facing problems of staggering complexity.
The American people got what they asked for when they voted for Jimmy Carter, and that they got somebody who was very honest and had a great deal of integrity, but had no experience whatsoever in Washington.
He came in thinking he could treat Congress like he treated the Georgia legislature, and it took him a while to get disabused of that notion.
For example, Carter proposed cutting back on spending for federal water projects. Who led the fight against him? Jim Wright, who was the Democratic majority leader in the House at the time. Well, you should never get yourself into that kind of a box.
And so even though it was a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president, they had a great deal of difficulty getting along, and as a result, Carter really had very few accomplishments as president.
But it's not just strained relations with Congress that plagued the Carter administration. The country is staggering under the burden of wage and price increases that are spiraling beyond control. Carter appoints Alfred Kahn as his inflation czar.
This rumpled suit-wearing Columbia University professor who had been the guru of airline deregulation was also beloved as a straight shooter, someone who would just tell the truth. When called before Congress to explain how the Carter administration could continue to support subsidies for sugar growers, which was clearly inflationary and going against their attempt to restrain the wage-price spiral, how could the administration do that? Well, Kahn didn't move, didn't speak, didn't gesture. A long, dramatic pause came. And then he cocked his head, looked at the cameras, looked at the senators, and said, "Let the record show an embarrassed silence." Everyone knew what Kahn couldn't say was that the Carter administration didn't have the guts to take on big sugar. There was always some reason, some excuse, some cross-cutting pressure.
The country's dependence on foreign sources of oil also reaches crisis levels in the summer of 1979, when instability in the Middle East produces a second major fuel shortage.
That was the summer of gasoline lines. People were afraid gas wouldn't be available at any price. Inflation was running at 14% a year. And in July of that year, Carter went to Camp David for close to 2 weeks. Camp David was the site of his greatest triumph. The previous September, he had brought Menachem Begin of Israel and Anwar Sadat of Egypt together, but this was a much unhappier retreat to Camp David. And when Carter came back, he gave a speech. He said he hadn't been leading the country, he'd just been managing the country. He shook up his cabinet, too, the same way that Ford had done in 1975. And just as had been the case with Ford's cabinet shakeup, this one didn't do Carter any good. And then, on November the 4th, 1979, militants in Iran seized the American embassy.
A hostage crisis results in a surge of support for the embattled president. But as the months go by without resolution, public sympathy fades.
Finally, in April of 1980, Jimmy Carter ordered military rescue of the remaining hostages in Tehran.
Late yesterday, I canceled a carefully planned operation which was underway in Iran to position our rescue team for a later withdrawal of American hostages. 8 of the crewmen were killed, and several other Americans were hurt in the accident.
It's hard to imagine today how badly people felt when that rescue mission failed. There also was an opening for Ronald Reagan, who was running once more for the Republican nomination. So the last year of the Carter administration, he was under very serious challenge. At the very end of 1979, Soviet forces entered Afghanistan to prevent the rise of an Islamic government.
The vital interest of our country, our security, is dangerously threatened.
An angry Carter imposes a series of economic sanctions on the Russians, cancels American participation in the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow, and withdraws SALT II from Senate consideration. But these actions do nothing to slow the momentum of the conservative movement.
Jimmy Carter was caught in the midst of an ideological shift to the right on the part of the American people. We often tend to blame Carter for being too caught up in the details, not being a shrewd enough politician. And I think as a relatively liberal democratic president heading a nation that was rapidly heading to the right, as we can see in hindsight, Jimmy Carter did a pretty good job.